morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Magandang umaga, hapon at gabi to our viewers from all over the world. We apologize for the slight delay, but there were some technical issues because apparently they've changed a few things around. But I am Eduardo Armenez, the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Public and Cultural Diplomacy of the Department of Foreign Affairs. Finally, after 4 weeks, we are now on our fifth and final episode of Tracing Our Roots, a webinar series brought to you by the Department of Foreign Affairs in partnership with the National Centennial Commission. The previous episodes of our webinar series introduced different perspectives on the lives of our ancestors and showed just how rich our pre-colonial history is. In today's episode, we build on that knowledge that our ancestors had a thriving community even way before the Philippines was so-called discovered. Before we begin, we would like to remind everyone that we highly encourage you to share your thoughts and ask questions to our speaker. Kindly send them in the comment section down below. Our technical team will collect the questions to be asked during that session after the presentation. Thank you, and we will now proceed to the discussion. Our speaker today is a senior history researcher of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines and concurrently supervises the Commission's local historical committees network and the National Centennial Committee Secretariat. He also sits as a board member of the Philippine Historical Association. A Master of Arts in History graduate and currently studying for his Doctor of Philosophy in History at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. His research interests are the Philippine early colonial history, the Philippine Revolution, and local community history. He founded Project Saysay Incorporated in 2013 and co-founded the National Youth Forum on Heritage in 2015. To talk about our unconquered ancestors from the ancient community of Boso-Boso, in his talk, Watering Manila from Ancient Boso-Boso, please welcome Mr. Ian Christopher Alfonso.
Good morning again, Asek Menyes. Good morning to our colleagues in the Department of Foreign Affairs and to our viewers. And may I share my PowerPoint? Okay. So my topic is divided into three parts. First, Boso-Boso being one of the major sources of Manila water supply during the Spanish period, because as of today, the water supply in Metro Manila is emanating from Bulacan, via Angat Dam. And second, Boso-Boso as an exemplar of local history where pre-colonial period began late. And that is the theme of the DFA webinar in observance of the Year of Filipino Pre-Colonial Ancestors. And third, appreciating local history, periodization in contrast to national history. And you might be wondering, where is Boso-Boso in the map? And why did I make it as a topic under the Year of Filipino Pre-Colonial Ancestors of DFA? Boso-Boso is actually is in Barangay San Jose, Antipolo City in Rizal. On your screen, it is the largest portion of the map of Antipolo in the eastern part of Antipolo. Although I have to caution each and everyone that there are two Boso-Boso in San Jose Antipolo. The first one is named Old Boso-Boso, which is a legitimate sitio of Barangay San Jose. The other one is New Boso-Boso, which is now a defunct political unit but remained a notable district in San Jose, particularly at Sitio Pantay. The occurrence of two Boso-Boso in Antipolo was brought by an event in 1911 when the U.S. insular government of the Philippine Islands depopulated and disbanded the municipality of Boso-Boso and relocated its people to a portion of Antipolo and founded New Boso-Boso. So on your screen is the Metro Manila Rizal terrain. So on the right side, the green part is actually the Chara Madre part, the Chara Madre mountain range. And pinned on the map are places associated or places within Boso-Boso in Antipolo Rizal. So you can see here Nuestra Senora de Anunciata. This is the patron saint, or the parish of the former municipality of Boso-Boso, which was eventually merged with Antipolo. And then there's this notable resort carrying the name Boso-Boso. So it is obviously the Boso-Boso is part of the Sierra Madre mountain range. And going back to my topic, so Boso-Boso was formerly a municipality, an independent town from Antipolo. And the reason why it was disbanded or and depopulated, surprisingly, because of pandemic. So what we are experiencing in our times right now, the COVID-19 pandemic, it's not actually the first time we experienced pandemic. So 119 years ago, or exactly 1902, the Philippines experienced a pandemic as deadly as COVID-19. It was a cholera pandemic. The Americans initially declared the end of the pandemic in the Philippines on March 8, 1904. Okay. So this is the cholera pandemic. Actually, the U.S. Insular Government of the Philippine Islands declared the outbreak of the pandemic only in 1902, but it already began as early as 1899 while we were at war with the U.S., the Philippine-American War. And it killed around 800,000 people worldwide, and surprisingly, 109,000 of these number were Filipinos. So that is why I compared it with COVID-19. It was actually as deadly as COVID-19, and because of the advancement of science and public knowledge about the COVID-19, hopefully we will no longer reach this number as compared with the deaths of the death toll of the cholera pandemic 119 years ago. And actually, one of the casualties of the pandemic 100 years ago was no other than the first foreign affairs secretary, Apolinario Mabini. He died on May 13, 1903. And the reason why the pandemic was widespread in the Philippines 119 years ago is quite similar to what is happening in the Philippines right now. The public's disregard of the necessity for quarantine measures and other precautions. And while the Americans declared the end of the pandemic in 1904, the pandemic re-emerged once again in August 1905. And from 1905 to 1908, another 22,758 recorded death. We recorded another tens of thousands of death after the 1904 supposed end of the pandemic. And the Filipinos and the humanity experienced the pandemic, this cholera pandemic, until 1923. So come to think of it, mga kababayan, we endured, our ancestors or our forebears 100 years ago endured the pandemic for almost 20 years. And And but how come a town like Boso-Boso had to be literally killed because of a pandemic? The reason was the fear of the colonial government that Manila water supply from the headwaters of Marikina Watershed Reservation situated at Boso-Boso would be contaminated with cholera, because the cholera bacteria is can be contracted through water. So actually, the Municipal Board of Manila as early as 1903 approved the depopulation or the disbandment of Boso-Boso for the preservation and safeguarding of the purity of the water supply for the city of Manila. So here is an excerpt from the Municipal Board report recommending the literal killing of the municipality of Boso-Boso, no? The depopulation of the town. So that was how Manila ordered the death of Boso-Boso, because vegetation and all animal life had to be removed from the entire watershed to bring the city supply within the bounds of the probable safety. And this was actually a proof of the extraordinary powers of the city of Manila then, that they could even determine the destiny of an LGU outside its jurisdiction. And one must realize that the water works was conceived by the city of Manila as early as 1841 and created in 1868, known as the Carieto Water Works, thus had the absolute control of the water system emanating from Boso-Boso. So that was the reason why city of Manila was too powerful over Boso-Boso, because it supplied, the capital city was at stake at that time. And then in 1903, owing to the austerity program of the American government, Boso-Boso was merged with Antipolo. This was not isolated in Boso-Boso. There were several towns across the country merged with other towns. In 1904, the Bureau of Government Laboratories supported the move to remove Boso-Boso from the proposed reservoir of Manila. 5 years later, the proposed reservoir and further improvement of Wawa Dam in Montalban, now Rodriguez Rizal, northwest of Boso-Boso, was carried out, and by 1911, the entire populace of Boso-Boso was ejected out of the area and re-established themselves far from the waters of original Boso-Boso, thus calling the new place New Boso-Boso. Wawa Dam closed in 1968 owing to structural problem. Carieto water system was obsolete already and no longer supplies Manila with water. Thus, people began to repopulate the old Boso-Boso. In 1987, the Camillian Fathers opened their mission in the now old Boso-Boso, and in 1995 they collaborated with the locals in reconstructing the old Boso-Boso church from its ruins abandoned in 1911. And in 2004, the old Boso-Boso church was again acknowledged as a parish and officially placed under the Camillian since then. So nevertheless, Boso-Boso never regained its status as a municipality, but its rich and very ancient history makes it a towering place in the province of Rizal, the later name of the province of Manila in 1902. Boso-Boso boasts the fact that it was a catalyst for the rise of permanent settlement of the natives in this part of Chara Madre. Since the fall of Manila, by the way, on your screen is the Carieto water system. It was created in 1868 to supply Manila with water, and the water supply emanated from the, as I said, from Marikina River system or watershed, and Boso-Boso occupied a significant significant part of the watershed. So this water emanating from Boso-Boso and other towns of present-day Rizal was treated underground. You know, if you will visit San Juan City, there is this place in San Juan City called El Deposito, meaning water treatment facility. So under that area, it was the water treatment facility of the Carieto water system, and it is now under the jurisdiction of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, and part of this underground water treatment complex was restored and conserved by the NHCP as part of its Museo El Deposito. And hopefully we can already open this to the public if the health situation in Metro Manila improves. So since the fall of Manila to the Spaniards in 1571, the Spanish colonizers were busy conquering communities around Manila Bay, and it is on your screen. And Laguna de Bay, and along Pasig River, Betis River, Pampanga River, Mekawayan River, and Bulacan River. These areas were thickly populated, and apparently the rugged terrains of northern and western Manila like Caloocan, San Juan del Monte, San Pedro de Makati, Mandaluyong, and San Francisco del Monte made the Spanish exploration decelerated. So on your screen is an 1819 map of Manila suburbs, and you can see here the hilly parts of Manila, which now you can barely see that there are hills surrounding Manila. That is why La Loma is called La Loma, because La Loma means hill in Spanish, and the logic behind the name Del Monte in Quezon City or San Francisco del Monte, because it is hilly back then. And formerly San Juan was called San Juan del Monte because it is located in the hilly parts of Metro Manila back then. And there are places in Makati wherein you can observe the geological formations like the limestones, like in particular in Guadalupe. So these are manifestations that these areas are part of the slopes of Chara Madre, and these were actually the farthest mountainous areas from Manila initially reached by the Spanish colonization. And even though Boso-Boso was closer to Caloocan via Novaliches corridor, the Spaniards reached it via Laguna de Bay, particularly through Tanay, one of the earliest pre-colonial communities, reorganized into a pueblo or Spanish town in 1606. And around this time, Antipolo was the farthest highland in this area, reorganized by the Spaniards in 1591 as a pueblo, although they reached it as early as 1578. Far north of Tanay are the mountainous areas of Sierra Madre inhabited by the unconquered Agtas or Aitas or Monteses in Spanish records. So on your screen is an 1899 map of Laguna de Bay. Here is Tanay, and on the far north is Boso-Boso. So the Spaniards reached Boso-Boso via Tanay instead of Metro Manila. As I said earlier, the rugged hills of the present-day Metro Manila impeded the Spaniards in advancing their exploration from that part. So for them, it was quite easy to reach the interiors of Sierra Madre via Laguna de Bai. And as record shows, they reached the communities of the Agtas or the Aitas of Sierra Madre via Panay, Rizal from Laguna de Bai. So from this point in 1669 or 98 years since the fall of Manila, the Spaniards reached the area of Boso-Boso. And that was the span of period the Spaniards spent to reach the mountains of northwest Manila. And this only means the Spanish colonization of Luzon in 1571 is a mere bravado because a large portion of the interiors of Luzon remained unconquered. Thus, the natives lived in pre-colonial way of life. So it was the Franciscan missionaries. Jesuit historian Father Murillo Velarde noted in his work in 1749 that there was already a church built in that area as they initially called it San Andres de la Latin, composed of two mountain communities of the Aitas. One is Lanatin and the second was Linotan, located on Mount Lanatin in Panay. It was recognized as a mission in 1670 by Father Francisco Barajas, Franciscan friar. Drawing some sense out of Father Velarde's account, Boso-Boso as a mission attended the religious needs of the Aitas. In fact, Father Barajas' original intention in the area was not to evangelize, but to explore the geological and geographical features of the area. The Lanatin is later known as Boso-Boso, while the name Lanatin remained the name of the major river in the mission. And presently, they are more known, these Aitas are more known as Dumagats, and the word of the Boso-Boso mission became evident when Archbishop Diego Camacho of Manila himself led the baptism of the natives there in 1699. Meanwhile, the discovery of iron and limestone deposit in Boso-Boso attracted non-Agta inhabitants to the place. This paved the way for elevation as a pueblo or town composed of Boso-Boso, Painaa, San Isidro, and San Ines in 1741. And it was almost the same year the Jesuits from Antipolo took over the administration of faith in Boso-Boso. Another contributory to the rise of the non-Aita inhabitants in the area, and most likely intermarriages, was the Tagalog revolt of 1745. A lot of Tagalogs from lower slopes like San Mateo, Rizal sought refuge in the interiors of the mountains. For almost a century since the intrusion of the Franciscans, the Agta trails in Chara Madre became beneficial to the Spaniards, especially when the British invaded Manila in 1762 and the royal treasury of the Spanish colony was transferred to Pagsanhan, Laguna, and the revenues from the newly arrived galleon named Filipino in Bicol were successfully transferred to Pampanga, the seat of the Filipino-backed Spanish government of Simon de Anda against the British via Chara Madre. And then Governor General Raon expelled the Jesuits from the Philippines effective July 23, 1768, and Boso-Boso was placed under the authority of the Archbishop of Manila. And then, what was pre-colonial in my lecture, by the way? Often disregarded in Philippine colonial history is the voice of the unconquered and the unvanquished, like the Agtas. These were the natives or group of people who remained free from Spanish way of life. They fortified themselves in the mountains and maintained indigenous freedom before the Spanish colonization. Historian Marianela Florendo contested the application of the periodization of national history into local history. In the case of her own homeland, the Cordilleras, and I quote, while Philippine history officially marks colonial period to the coming of Miguel Lopez de Legazpi in 1565, it would not only be in the 1800s that the Cordillera came under the Spanish direct rule. Because of the Spanish claim of the space, the Cordillera was within the orbit of the colonial space, but outside the colonial polity. And this was mainly because the Cordillera settlements continued to maintain their sovereignty and were reacting to the Christianized settlements successfully placed under reduction and later latter Spanish political consolidation. Therefore, in writing local history, the boundary between pre-colonial and colonial periods should be determined not by national history, but by localities. Obviously, Cebu was colonized in 1565, but not Luzon, especially Manila until 1571. More so, Boso-Boso until 1669, and so on and so forth. Another case in point is the Zambales sector of Central Luzon. The Spaniards collectively called the unconquered mountain peoples of the area as Zambales. So Zambales was actually a term for the unconquered peoples of the mountainous area of Central Luzon facing West Philippine Sea until it became a place name now we know as the province of Zambales. And actually Zambales, when the Spaniards referred to Zambales, they meant actually different cultural communities, especially the Zambal themselves. There is actually Zambal cultural communities. And the Spaniards also called the dark-skinned brethren of ours, the Aitas of Pampanga, Tarlac, and Bataan, as Zambales. If not of the conquest of Mabalacat, now a town of Pampanga, which was the abode of the rulers of the Aitas of Pampanga in 1712, Tarlac, as we know it today, would not be opened. Because Tarlac was a terrain or was part of the original Aita territories. And this portion of Central Luzon, we call Tarlac, was actually separated Pampanga from Pangasinan. And from Tarlac and from this area of Mabalacat, Angeles, Porac area came the Aitas, who frequently attacked the Kapampangans and the Spaniards in the southern part of Pampanga or the riverine communities of Pampanga. Historian Gino Dizon appraised the Aitas' dignity by calling their incessant attacks to the Spaniards and the Kapampangans as Aita Wars, which of course never recognized by the Spaniards that there was indeed Aita Wars. And the Kapampangans' fear of the Aitas subconsciously remained in the way the Kapampangans called the Aitas as pugot or headless, actually referring to the activity of the Aitas beheading Spaniards and Kapampangans in a farm or village during the colonial period, and the Kapampangan term capre or capre, from the Spanish word cafre or the non-Christian people, especially the dark-skinned people, whom the Kapampangans imagined as malevolent, supernatural creatures dwelling on trees, most likely a figurative expression of how the Aita warriors camouflage when they attack a village. The reason for this series of attacks were obviously the encroachment of both the Spaniards and the Kapampangans to the Aita territories. And later, these Aitas were displaced from their original territories. And they settled in the mountains as we now know them. In Chara Madre, the local history of the Aitas of Boso-Boso can be determined can determine the boundary of pre-colonial and colonial periods in 1669. But this is quite complicated, If we will just ascribe, if we will use the arrival of the Spaniards in Boso-Boso in 1669 as the end of the pre-colonial period of the Aitas in Sierra Madre, we still need further studies about this, because the Dagat Aitas of Sierra Madre are widespread across Sierra Madre. I'm not sure if the Dumagats of Bulacan, of Aurora, or Quezon, or Cagayan, or Nueva Vizcaya, or Nueva Ecija had initial contacts before 1669. But history is certain that the earliest known contact, or the earliest known conversion of the Agtas or the Dumagats was 1669 via Boso-Boso. Although, as I said, it doesn't guarantee that this should be the end of pre-colonial period of the Aitas of Sierra Madre, because up until 1898, or the end of the Spanish colonization, the Agtas or the Dumagats maintained their indigenous freedom, roaming around the Sierra Madre, because the said mountain range, Sierra Madre, they call it Mahabe Pagotan, or for them, it was their world, the Mahabe Pagotan. And they live free. They live in freedom in Mahabe Pagotan, and they are not actually savage as we think, or they have their own worldview, customs, tradition, and way of life. And they actually have a name for their supreme being. They call it Makidapat or Makijepat, which is a cognate of the Kapampangan word Makidapat, and they all mean the creator. And they also have Talagong Panos, which in the Dumagat folklore, he is a friendly giant who, like them, wears a red bahag or G-string. This story is quite similar to the Hispanized Bernardo Carpio of Pamitinan or Tapusi in Rodriguez Rizal. And Tapusi, actually, to the Dumagats, is a sacred mountain they call Bato sa Sare. Giant rock formations shaped like a footstep of a giant in the Sierra Madre site of Norsagaray, Bulacan, the Dumagats folklorically ascribed to Talagong Panos. And among the Tagalogs, that footstep is according to the Tagalogs, is of Bernardo Carpio. So the Dumagat Tagalog folklore share similarities. So because of Talagong Panos, So the story of Talagong Panos of the Dumagats and Bernardo Carpio of the Tagalogs are quite similar. And even though it never regained its status as a municipality, Boso-Boso is an epitome of how dynamic local history should be. According to Florendo, space or territory is an issue in determining the boundary of local history of an unvanquished cultural community, because our notion of political boundaries were originally set by the colonizers. And in the case of the Agtas or the Dumagats, their pre-colonial period may be ended or could have been ended in 1669 when Boso-Boso was reorganized into Spanish settlement. But it can still be contested because a lot of Dumagats lived under freedom until the colonial contact changed their culture and destiny in various areas of Sierra Madre. And others maintained indigenous freedom and heritage at all until the end of Spanish colonization. in 1898. The Dumagat's local history should be revisited without mimicking the national history's periodization. And Lorendo, to end, argued that in accepting the Philippines is archipelagic and diverse, there should be greater openness to more nuanced interpretation of historical development. So the gist of my lecture is to appraise Boso-Boso, which is now a mere sitio of Antipolo, and use it as an exemplar of local history, wherein we can see that pre-colonial period, the end of pre-colonial period, differs from one place to another. So the convention that the Spanish colonization began in 1565 is not actually applicable in various places in the country. We can peg 1565 as the year the Philippines per se was colonized and ending the pre-colonial period. But as the colonization progressed, the pre-colonial period must also adjust. So in the case of Luzon, pre-colonial period ended in 1571. But as you enter various provinces and cultural communities, pre-colonial period will again differ. So in the case of Boso-Boso and the Aitas, they remained unconquered or living under pre-colonial way of life almost 100 years since the fall of Manila in 1571. What more, the other cultural communities like the defiant Aitas of Pinatubo, of Zambales mountain range, and as Dr. Marianela Torrendo use an example, the Cordilleras. They remained unconquered until 19th century or almost 200 years or 250 years since the arrival of the Spaniards. If we will use 1565 as our peg or as our reckoning date of Spanish colonization of the Philippines. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian, for that very enlightening discussion and for clarifying that concept about colonialization and the fact that we should consider the start or the end of pre-colonial history at different times within the national history because of the access to these different communities. We shall now proceed to the question and answer portion of the program. And we do have a number of questions already. The first is from Lionel Casimiro. What do you think are the significant and important contributions of Ancient Boso-Boso to Manila and their cultural effects?
Actually, the people of Boso-Boso had no direct impact or what they call this contribution to the people of Manila. It was their homeland or their territory, because Boso-Boso was situated in the watershed of Marikina River headwaters. So the water being supplied to Manila from 1860s until 1900s was emanating from them. So maybe we can rephrase the question. So what was the impact the other way around of Manila to Boso-Boso? Because as we heard earlier, Manila was too powerful to disband or to kill an ancient municipality or an ancient territory. which was reorganized into a pueblo or municipality during the Spanish period. So it was actually the other way. It is actually the other way around. You know, how Manila impacted the people of Boso-Boso. And this was actually not the first time. Actually this is just the precedent. And the most recent example that we can ascribe to this case of Boso-Boso being killed, being killed, was the experience of the people of Pantabangan in Nueva Ecija when Pantabangan Dam was constructed during the Marcos time. And well, maybe because there was no social media then, the media was suppressed, the people, we didn't hear anything, people complaining or rallying against the Pantabangan Dam, because the original barangays or the original pueblo of Pantabangan was submerged under the dam. So just recently, I think last year or 2 years ago, the water level of Pantabangan Dam, the water level of Pantabangan Dam went down, and the original structures like the Rizal Monument of Pantabangan, the old municipal hall, the ruins of the old church of Pantabangan emerge once again from the bottom, and from because of the low water, what the how do you call this, the Pantabangan Dam water the water reserves of Pantabangan Dam went low for a certain period. So Pantabangan is quite lucky because it was not ordered to be disbanded or merged to another town, unlike Boso-Boso. And I haven't encountered any LGUs with similar fate like Boso-Boso, that they had to shut down a town in favor or to give way for this kind of scenario like the cholera pandemic. So when we should understand or contextualize the time. It was a need of the time. Manila was the capital city, and of course we are under the US rule, and the Americans were also worried about their own safety. They supported the move of the city of Manila to totally obliterate from the map the ancient Boso-Boso.
Thank you, Ian. The next question is from Gerald Semana. How did the Spaniards communicate with the Agtas, Aitas Dumagat, assuming that there was a language barrier between them?
We should account that there was already a linkage between the upland and lowland people, and even before the arrival of the Spaniards, they already had interaction among them. That's why we have these places across the country like Ilaya, Ilawod, Saraya, Sairod. So the lowland, the upland territories. I mean, this kind of socio-economic or socio-political connections between those living upstream like Boso-Boso and the downstream. Probably Tanay Rizal, all the people or the inhabitants, the Tagalog inhabitants surrounding Laguna de Bay. So probably they established a lingua franca, a local lingua franca, and most likely that was Tagalog. That was Tagalog. And 1669 was already a matured period of Spanish colonization, in which a lot of Spanish missionaries already learned the vernaculars in the country, because as early as 1582 there was a move or an effort among the missionaries, the early missionaries, the Spanish missionaries, to learn the languages of our ancestors to propagate Christian faith. And Tagalog was among the major languages they learned. And the Aitas, Boso-Boso, was part of the I mean, it's just in the outskirts of the Tagalog territory. So most likely Tagalog was the the language the missionaries used to interact with the Dumagats. And I'm not sure if there was if there is an existing study or dictionary or vocabulary recorded by the friars. Uh, an Agta or a Dumagat Spanish dictionary, because there are lots of this. There are several dictionaries written by the friars about our vernaculars. I mean, the Hiligay non Spanish dictionary, Pampango Spanish dictionary, and hopefully there was, or there is Agta or Dumagat Spanish dictionary waiting to be discovered.
Yes, I think also you mentioned the fact that the Jesuits were there, and if you go to Boso-Boso now, as you mentioned, the church was reconstructed, and from what I understand, that church was built in the 1700s. So I presume that if a church was built, then they were trying to also maybe convert the natives, or had the natives attending church. So there was some sort of communication
Yes.
From that time. Uh, uh, the question we have next is from Mr. Jordan Macapagal. Quite interesting. Are the pictures of the Cafre in the Murillo Velarde map depicting the Aitas from the Philippines? Are they the Cafre, the Aitas from the Philippines, or blacks from East Africa? So apparently there's a reference to Cafre image on the Murillo Velarde map.
Okay, so I'll revisit the Murillo map because I pulled out, or I just cropped that Capre part of the Murillo map. And if you will see the Murillo map, there is this on both sides of the map, not just the map per se. On both sides, Murillo and his Tagalog engraver, I think his surname was Bagay. They incorporated snippets, vignettes of various peoples the Spaniards encountered in the country, in the Philippines, the foreigners and the natives, and also some native scenes. The a scene in a farmland with monkeys and crocodiles. So I assume that the capres, or the negritos depicted in the Murillo map is indeed the negritos or the Aitas of the Philippines. So I'll revisit the Murillo map and read more about these engravings in the map. But another, it's not just the Murillo map that I use as a source. There are several studies written by Dr. Lino Dizon, one of the commissioners of the NHCP, about the Aitas. And Capre, and it is not just among the Kapampangas, but also among the Tagalogs and other Philippine cultural communities. They have this idea of Capre, a supernatural being, and I associated it with the Aitas because of the fear. There was this accounts of frequent incessant attacks of the Aitas against the Kapampangans. They beheading the Kapampangans, kidnapping Spaniards because of the intrusion. They encroach already their territories, and of course, the Aitas fought back to these intruders, the Kapampangans and the Spaniards. So, and that is how I theorize Capre developed as something dark-skinned and and tree-dwelling creatures and I associated it with the kind of warfare the Aitas had then to to climb trees and use their blowpipes to attack a community.
Thank you. That's a very interesting theory because obviously, I guess that the term capre was Spanish in origin, and so it would be interesting to trace if the capre that we know from our mythology is well arose from the Spanish term, or whether it has an own indigenous source. But yes, it's true. Perhaps the way that the tribe well preyed upon the community may have led to this belief of supernatural.
And if I may, yes, if I may add as Menyes, a lot of our pre-colonial, the elements or the figures in society that against or taboo in the new colonial culture or colonial way of life, like the Babaylanes or the Babaylans, the Catalonans, the pre-colonial priestess and priests, being respected by our ancestors, were demonized. So like the Aitas, as I theorize, they were ascribed as capres, and then here were our pre-colonial priestess and priests ascribed as aswangs or as brujas or mangkukulam, just to demonize them, and even our ancestors were actually victims of demonization. We call that encantos. Encanto is also a Spanish loan word meaning enchanted. So we call them, our ancestors eventually became transformed into enchanted beings, or maligno, malign spirits. Maligno is a Spanish term. We don't have these terms before the Spanish age, obviously. What we have were the beliefs or the regard of our ancestors to our departed loved ones, departed rulers, departed warriors as nuno. So the Babaylans invoke their memories or their spirits in a ceremony to ask these departed spirits some advices how to combat this barangay, or how to deal with this epidemic or this pestilence happening in their community. So our concepts of maligno, encanto, duende were imported and embraced by us. But we need to what they call this. We need to discriminate things, historically. That's why in 2015 I initiated a brief study how these supernatural beings evolved through time using historical documents and dictionaries. And you will be surprised. Every generation has their description of these supernatural beings.
Yeah, that's a very interesting account, and by a dominant force of ideas on others, which has shaped how we think about our own mythologies. We have a question from Delia Mendoza. What was the reaction of the people of Boso-Boso when the place was closed?
this is actually one of the puzzling things about the population of Boso-Boso. Searching for any accounts or newspapers or memoirs of personalities involved or might have knowledge about this closure or this advent of a town, but most likely these people were distressed. How come they were already living there since pre-colonial times, and then they were being displaced for a city like Manila, and we can speculate that there were resentments, but as I said, we need to dig more accounts or historical sources to support those speculations. But definitely, even me being displaced in my hometown will be resentful about to the authorities. And we can see this pattern naman, when our when our when our people or our brethren being ejected from their lands. And history is rich in this kind of displacement. It's not just isolated with Boso-Boso, but Boso-Boso is quite unique because the entire town was removed, not only the people.
Yes. Well, I think since you mentioned that it happened in the early 20th century, and that most of them were moved to new Boso-Boso, so there might be descendants, or maybe one of our viewers around the world or here in the Philippines could provide you some leads on that particular question. Um, and perhaps conscious of the time, we started late, but we're also ending late. We have a final question, and I think you touched upon this earlier. Did the people of Boso-Boso have any friendly relations with people in the nearby provinces, and did they have trading relations with other people and other tribes?
Well, this is the this is the what they call this the this is what lacking in this research, the voice of these people recorded by the Spaniards, because most of the sources I use are about the founding of the mission of the Franciscans in the area. And unfortunately, the chroniclers like Murillo Velarde himself, he was not just a cartographer but also a chronicler. He did not actually. Velarde is among those who documented well Boso-Boso in the 18th century or 1700s, and he did not mention the socio-political or socio-economic setup of Boso-Boso. They just mentioned that we entered this place, we met these Monteses or mountain dwelling people, converted them, just like that. We this the ethnographic part of that if what language did they use, whom they were trading with, were they transacting with the Tagalog sa Bulacan, because as I said, the Dumagats, they acknowledge the entire Chara Madre as their own country or their own world. So they obviously meet people from Quezon, from Aurora, from Bulacan, and this is the reason why we need to strengthen the indigenous studies, because in the absence of historical materials, we can draw or abstract sense from the indigenous way of life, their customs, and their, as you said, as Ekmenyes, the need to gather oral history or stories from the people themselves. So maybe that is how I answer the question. As of now, we need more study about the ancient people of Boso-Boso.
Well, related to that, does Boso Boso mean something like many other names that you mentioned, San Juan del Monte,
Yes.
etc.?
Actually, I still need to ask the culture bearers or the dumagats themselves what is boso-boso in their vernacular. Well, in Tagalog, it means different thing, no, boso-boso. But this is an indigenous name which I think is not a Tagalog word, but a dumagat term. And there are lots of place names recorded by the Spaniards, and unfortunately, the Spaniards did not leave any etymology or meaning of the place name. They just arbitrarily recorded these names. So maybe through as time passes by, the meanings or the context of this place names vanish. But let's see if the language, the culture bearers themselves, they're in their vernaculars, it has a significant meaning. But my kutob, or I guess this is not a Tagalog term.
Thank you again, Ian, for this very interesting episode. And we'd like to thank everyone who sent in their questions. Unfortunately, we were coming to the end of our program. And well, for me in particular, it's very interesting. The takeaways for me at this point for this episode would be that important point that was raised about local history periodization. The pre-colonial history setting of the time changes. It depends on when our colonizers were able to actually reach that particular part of the Philippines. So it differs. And of course, the fact that there is much to be learned still about our indigenous history, our pre-colonial history. So this is really something that all Filipinos should have more interest in. So before we end, let me present you with a virtual certificate of appreciation, as I did previously, and I will read the certificate as soon as it is shown on screen. But the Department of Foreign Affairs presents the certificate of appreciation to Mr. Ian Christopher Alfonso for sharing his invaluable insights and expertise as a resource speaker on the fifth and final episode of Tracing Our Roots, a webinar series on Filipino pre-colonial ancestors held on 30 September 2021 on the official Facebook page and YouTube channel of the DFA, given this 30th day of September, signed by yours truly, Assistant Secretary Eduardo Menez. So again, we'd like to thank Mr. Alfonso for joining us today and sharing his knowledge with us all around the world. We would like to give our thanks to all our speakers over the past 5 weeks and to all the participants who took the time to watch this webinar series from wherever and whatever time around the world. And we would like to ask you to fill up the form box for those who wish to receive their certificates of attendance for today's webinar. As we conclude this webinar series, we hope that we contributed to raising awareness on the narratives of pre-colonial Philippines, and we hope that this will in turn strengthen our identity as a Filipino people with a rich cultural heritage even before the arrival of the colonizers. For those of you who may be wondering, the Zoom background that I have is actually a copy of the Laguna copper plate, which is also evidence of the pre-colonial ties that our ancestors had with the rest of the world. This has been Assistant Secretary Eduardo Menez on behalf of the Department Department of Foreign Affairs, we wish everyone a pleasant morning. And again, thank you for everyone's participation. And to Ian, again, we are a very good partner in cultural diplomacy. Thank you, everyone.